Welcome to Living Life, Dying Death, the place for healthy conversations about death and dying. I'm Jennifer Collins Taylor, and today I'm joined by Dr. Robert Neimeyer. Welcome.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you. We are at the ADEC conference. ADEC stands for the Association for Death Educators and Counselors. I was talking to someone yesterday, and they called you a rock star in the field of thanatology. A rock star. And I liked that. You are a great communicator. You're highly, highly respected in the field. You have 24 books, authored over 300 pages of, not pages, but papers and articles. You're an editor for a very highly respected journal, supportive of so many people's work. You're very compassionate. And I wonder where you think that creativity and that inspiration and your energy comes from.
The answer would be simple. It comes from people. It comes from relationships. And I think that that's the font of energy for most of us who are animated to do this work, that we are moved by our caring about fellow human beings. We're moved by compassion, by curiosity, sometimes by courage, and occasionally by creativity. And so at my best, I'd love to earn each of those descriptions. On an average day, I'd be lucky to be described by any one of those terms, and some days by none at all. But I find that the blend, that kind of amalgam of things that represents writing, really as a way of just continuing conversations beyond the face-to-face context to really reach maybe a broader group of folks who might join in the conversation, is very appealing to me. My clinical practice is very appealing to me as a practicing psychologist who specializes in issues of loss, grief, transition. I certainly am taught much more by my clients than I ever was by my professors with respect to things that have ultimate meaning and value. And then I think in my own life, understanding the role of my mortality, my finitude, that is, none of us has an eternity, at least in this veil on this earth, to accomplish what we wish to. I think all of these things tend to suggest that making use of one's time in a way that is meaningful to us and to others has value.
That connections that we have with one another.
It certainly is what animates me. I find that I have, when I have opportunities to talk to someone, as you're giving me this opportunity now, I feel privileged by that, and I want to earn that right through taking seriously what we might come up with together that neither of us alone could really develop in just the same way. So it is a precious opportunity you're giving me, and I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Could you tell our audience a little bit about your work in meaning reconstruction?
Yeah.
What that means.
It's a mouth-filling term, isn't it?
Did I say it correctly?
Yes, this is when you know that I am an academic psychologist in addition to a practicing one. I teach at the University of Memphis in Tennessee. I love teaching both undergraduate and graduate students. I love teaching professionals who I work with in contexts of professional continuing education, helping them to, in a sense, develop best practices that are most responsive to the needs of people undergoing life transitions or experiencing bereavement. I love communicating, writing. I like reading the work of others and helping it move toward print. And I find that all of these roles, as well as supervision of my students in their research efforts, the research that I do to see what really works for people in terms of helping them with their grief, all of these are important aspects of my daily and weekly life. So that's a little bit by way of broad brush treatment of how I spend my time.
Okay. And the meaning reconstruction, if you could explain that to us and how that applies to the grief work and the research and the clinical applications for that.
Well, I think an older understanding of grieving was that somehow it moved forward in fairly predictable stages that would begin with denial as we push back from the hard reality of a loved one's death. And as we would take on board then with varying passages through anger and depression, perhaps bargaining in some sense with the universe or with God for a reversal of this cruel fate of the pending loss of our own life or the loss of the life of another, but moving ultimately toward a kind of acceptance, recovery, or the like. This conception of the grieving process though it certainly intends to normalize many of the emotional transitions of grief, greatly simplifies a journey that is far more individual, far more shaped by our experience in our families and cultures, shaped by our own personalities, our own styles of relationship, so that loss will mean something different to you than it does to me. And even if we have lost the same mutually important person, it doesn't mean that our grief will be the same. So to understand the individuality of grief, what is uniquely personal about just this loss, for just me or for you, I think it's helpful to see the life story in which that loss is accommodated. That is, how does the death of my son, or my father's suicide, or my wife's death, or my mother's emphysema, and so on, how does that affect the story of my life that I have built up across the decades of my living? And how does it shape not only those sources of meaning that have been traditionally available to me in that relationship, but also those sources of ultimate meaning toward which I was moving, presumably in companionship with this loved other. And so, in some sense, losing another is like having the book of your life open before you, and then having all of the chapters from this point forward simply ripped out and discarded to be rewritten anew in light of a grievous loss, where a central character in our life story will no longer play at least a physical role in those future chapters. And in this sense, I think the goal of grieving, or at least a cardinal process in grieving, a major process, would be to somehow reaffirm or rebuild a life meaning that has been disrupted by loss.
A new narrative.
A new narrative, a new story of who are we now in light of this loss. Because in light of it, in a sense, we have to relearn who we are and relearn what the world is, because both are changed in some important measure by the subtraction of this person from our life. Even as we go about trying to capture psychologically, in conversation, perhaps spiritually, their continued presence in our life, but in a different way than when they were physically seated side by side with us, sleeping with us at night, working at the next desk in the office, and so on.
So meaning reconstruction in a very literal sense.
Yes, that's right. We're rebuilding a world of meaning that has been shaken and sometimes shattered by the experience of loss, particularly when that loss is traumatic, sudden, unanticipated, and we have no time to wrap our hearts or minds around its reality.
And that is one of your many areas of expertise, is complicated grief. Is that correct, and very complex?
Yes, when grief is complicated, it may be so for a number of reasons. It may be complicated because this relationship was complicated, or complicated because my relationships in general have been. Maybe my life has taught me that it's a precarious thing to find a relationship in which we are truly loved and understood. And others will often misunderstand or even mistreat or neglect us. And so when we find that one special person who gives us this quality of attachment and caring that we have long craved, then the loss of that person will often shake us to our very foundations as we feel radically alone in the world. So sometimes when our history is complex in this way, so too will our grief be complex.